come on, I'm joking about that. It's just that better than the dog's chain. You know, the dog's chain. I'm like a person who needs a lot of freedom. So that's the thing. Oh, I have to be awake. Yes. Yeah, public have not.
Anupama Kundu es una arquitecta de Mumbai. Muestra interés en la investigación de materiales y en la experimentación de proyectos arquitectónicos que tienen un impacto reducido en el medio ambiente y que se adapta al contexto socioeconómico. Ha realizado proyectos en India y tiene experiencia en trabajar, investigar y enseñar en diferentes contextos culturales de todo el mundo. Con ustedes, Anupama Kundu.
So I just go now and start talking? Yes. All right. How do I start this? Hello everyone. Really a big pleasure to be here, and I want to thank all my Mexican friends. Miguel, thanks a lot for bringing me here. And yes, for all those who told me that I would recognize a lot of familiarities with India, being here, I confirm. And being here, looking at similar problems, but you know, dealing with them differently is also a great education for me. So thank you all. I would like to start by describing, you know, the title of my intervention. I've titled it Building Knowledge because you know, in my formative years, when I graduated and started my office 25 years ago, already 25 years ago when I was a young graduate, we didn't have the data like we saw today from Richard Burdett, but we knew, our generation knew that we are in a situation of a rapidly transforming landscape through this kind of unprecedented urbanization. So in the beginning, we were, at least I was, very concerned about how I will continue to practice architecture. And initially, I put a lot of attention on trying to find new knowledge to be able to build buildings with a significantly less impact on resources, because we realized that the kind of consumption patterns that were set before us are not going to suffice if each and every Chinese, African, Indian is going to have housing of that kind of standard. Then there's just not enough resources to go around. But today I would interpret this title, Building Knowledge, as more as a process where building is a verb, where every act of architecture, every research project I do, every trip I make, I think what I'm trying to facilitate is the process of building knowledge about how to cope with our current urban transformations. So with that background, I would like to go on to show some of my work, some of my own journey, but also because I see a lot of students here, I do want to establish the context in which I produced my work. So I'm just going to say some of the key words that express, you know, or summarize the context in which all of us are practicing today. So the first thing is this, a completely rural landscape rapidly transforming into urban. That the fact that these same people, when they live in an urban setting, the mindset does not transform as rapidly as the physical environment. The second very important concern for me is the fact that while India occupies 2.4% of the world's land, it has 16% of the world's population. This is really, really important because when we saw the first, one of the early pictures of Richard Burdett's graphs, where there was a pink line which established what is sustainable, and India was below that, unlike many of the other countries. See, in our case, we have enormous population in a very small amount of land. So regardless of what other countries establish as sustainable or green, we just don't have the resources. We have to establish new standards, and if we manage to, we have to stay within that belt, because we just don't have the resources. We have less cake to share. We have to cut the pieces smaller. And if we manage to live in a way that due to those pressures, I think we could set new standards which others should then also follow. So these problems are actually opportunities to improve the norm. So that is one important aspect. The other thing is that most of these new cities that are coming up and the way globalization influenced developments are, projecting, the Indian GDP is doing well. They are trying to sell this sort of a 21st century city, but the ground reality, you can see pigs roaming around and cows and all these animals, and you see that the ground is not prepared to receive this kind of buildings, which Singapore, Dubai, these buildings could be anywhere. They are also entering India, and this would be a disastrous trend. In the same area of Gurgaon, you can see here that there are three skylines. There's a middle skyline, which is the outskirts of Delhi growing gradually without planning along the highways. People adding shops, a residence on top, and then just increasing as and how they want. But then you see the other kind of rapid development taking place with all these multinational companies coming and putting up buildings of the same standard with complete central air condition and so on. And while that is happening, you see the slums being also created. So, this kind of informal developments and slums are actually part of the process that we actually don't recognize that we are creating ourselves with this kind of urbanization. So, one of the most important concerns for me is social segregation, that we are creating, cities where, like this is Bombay. When I grew up in Bombay 25 years ago, the urban form was not so drastically, polarized. So this is not only a problem of India. All the future cities have this issue. And apart from what it does to the urban form, and apart from the fact that the citizens don't have equal access to certain places, to parks and to equal amenities, physical or social, the fact that we propagate social segregation is something really disturbing. And cities like Bombay, which have like the slum dwellers and the street dwellers who are not even in slums, they are the majority. So we are not talking about something that we can neglect anymore. So these are the sort of concerns that force me already then to think in a different way. So right from the beginning, all my projects are worrying about this kind of trends that we have. And the final one, which I forgot to mention, is this one, that all the vernacular materials, that the rich diversity of building technologies we have, just like we have, I see here as well with the food or with everything else, that there's a diverse culture, all of it very rapidly being replaced by only one material or one technology. This is a big concern for me, and I know that we've been on one hand going, like we saw the previous presentation, forced to go high rise, which means high tech, high technology. We have, a lot of us in India do question how much it can be simplified in and be only a high tech landscape. So technology is also the negotiation for me between how much high tech and how much low tech to go, how much machine made, how much handmade to enable through design, how many people should get jobs out of that development in the local area versus industries that are centralized. So all these issues come into my concerns. And so this is, I'm going to now show a few of my early projects without describing each and everything. I graduated from Bombay, and I started my practice when I was 23 years old. And I went to live in a rural area called Auroville, where a city, an international city was planned. And so this is one of my first projects. A Frenchman asked me to design a house with some mixed use. But in that area, I actually discovered that there were potters living nearby, and I started investigating because I knew that these urban transitions that take place displace a lot of jobs, etc. So I found out, I mean, I used to always see these potters trying to sell things that nobody wanted to buy anymore because nobody wanted terracotta cooking pots, etc. So I started thinking that if urbanization could, rather than be a loss of livelihood, if it could be the, if urbanization could provide them the security to keep their crafts, it was not so much only for being, I'm not at all nostalgic about preserving crafts and craftsmanship. Yes, the ability to make the pot. I don't mind if that particular pot goes out of use, but if we forget how to make things, then I think that is, over one generation you can lose that, and that what are the effects of, consequences of this kind of losses, was something I was concerned about. But more than that, I was chasing a high quality roofing system that, being in a remote area, I didn't want to take, I wanted to do as much as possible from the place and make, have the local people involved in the construction of their things. So that's the way I felt place would be grounded in my architecture, through the materials but also through the technologies. And so my first experiments were with terracotta, because I used to work a lot with potters. You see me from those days, figuring out with a whole lot of people and supporting what we don't know through the knowledge of others and through the experience of others. So I therefore today am a firm believer of redefining education as, as something. Knowledge is not only obtained in universities. It's time to collaborate. It's time to give enough value to experiential learning, as well as, the typical academic, knowledge that we chase. But a lot of things were enabled because there was collaboration with craftsmen. The thing is, instead of keeping them out of the process and telling them just what to do, I used to, and I probably did it because of I was naive, and I did it more out of a common sense approach. Today there are many terms for all of this, participation and all of that. For me, the thing is, if I would build in full scale and explain to them in full scale what's going on with engineering, with construction and so on, then everybody in the team could actually collaborate with their wisdom rather than being only mechanically doing something. So people understood what is going on, and the areas where I didn't have enough experience, I could be supported by all of them. So I started seeing there's so much virtue in doing things in full scale, because then it connects everybody. There's a lot of mystification in each and every profession separately, So I started, this was my first project where, terracotta roof, the roofing system of this place made any other support structure redundant. So tiles that are used in that place, which require a lot of timber to support it, was much more, we got an insulated roof. We had something we could produce put together in a week. It was quick. It was, simple formwork, etc. So this was my first project, which had a lot of research. There's ferrocement fins, there's things I was trying to explore after my fascination with Nervi, and there's a lot of other explorations that took place. But from this first project, what actually continued in my future projects was the way to collaborate with engineers. At that time, there was no engineers whom I could find to do this kind of thing. So this was mostly calculated by myself, and with the support and feedback of the craftsmen who said, there's no way this will work, or this is over-designed. And that's how we developed certain things here. But then eventually, at that time, in order for me to keep being an architect, and take a lot of radical decisions, I myself, lived in a house which was, I could say, the most affordable thing I could do at that point, because I wasn't supported by my family or anything. I had to always, take care of my life, which is, I thank my circumstances today, because I realized that if you go for security over, if you go for adventure over security, then you don't have to be afraid of anything. And, something good comes out of it. So the more and more struggles I had, I realized that I need less and less. And I came to a core of my state of freedom, and I started doing whatever I wanted. And the focus was on learning. So this was a series of research done with roundwood structures, The fact that if you harvest the thinning of a forest, and the timber section which would need 25 years of a 25-year-old tree to get that kind of rectangular section, if you use it as a circular piece, then you could harvest it in 3 years. That's the difference. And that's why a lot of people live in huts. And while I, did this kind of practice, in order not to, compromise, and not to have to do certain things to, threaten my profession or work in certain kind of offices, I just camped. I started living in a hut that I made for myself. I had my motorbike. I had a solar panel on the roof. I had one lamp which I would take to various places, and I had a car stereo, 12-volt music system. And I realized when I was living in this house and finding lots of time for contemplation about what I wanted to do with my life, I realized that the main resource is my life itself. And that's why I became very focused on what I want to do with it and what I want to build. And eventually, I also built, every research you do becomes a prototype for something else. So a lot of jobs came for that type of research. So in this case, a lot of, eco-tourism projects which require you to leave no imprint when you, dismantle, So we did a few things like that. But I started a series of research called Form Follows Technology, because technology, for me, it's not only about the choice of material. Like if you decide to build with stone, that's not, a brick is not a brick, and a stone is not just a stone. Whether you do it as, carry huge blocks in the old style, or you do a sophisticated, highly engineered system, the material doesn't automatically mean a specific technology. So I started looking at the relationship between form, architectural form, building technology, construction material, and the socio-economic impact of our choices in a very wider landscape. So through this kind of investigations, this is just an example of my roundwood research, that much later when I taught at the AA we had a year with, in the diploma unit with Andrew Freer, where, this Hook Park, which they had acquired, was the topic of their diploma strategy plan for Hook Park, and with Andy Goldsworthy's nest, made out of apparently linear-looking forest. In order for them to demystify the Fry Auto structures that were standing there in Roundwood, I decided to take them to India for the experience of this thinking with the hands approach, where they were given toolkits of all their model material, whatever material we had bought for their workshop, in 1:50 scale, and then we had. In 10 days, I often do this kind of thing where in a matter of a week or 10 days, we can build a physical thing and learn in full scale. Because I think, like when we saw the previous presentation and the speed at which the landscape is transforming, education cannot be so slow that after 5 or 7 years of a rigorous education, all you've achieved is up to concept stage. And then you don't realize that design is going to go on till the building is built, till the scale of drawings get bigger and bigger, till you take decisions and the whole thing is built. So I find it very important to plug in such a thing in the studio, so that I try to help my students to confront 4 realities through which their design must be informed. They must have experience of true scale. They must design like a fashion designer or any other designer in true scale, true materials, through real people and real place. If they don't have this experience, then it doesn't feed back their design. It remains too theoretical. So this is an example of that kind of studio where, you know, I often bring people from practical people in the jury. You know, the 12 students had to build their own version in 1 or 2 days. They have to submit a model for a tower in a botanical garden in India. The reason for going to India is because many things are possible at it costs very little to do that. On the other hand, being in a different context makes you look at things and not take them for granted. So then we choose the winning entry and all the 12 students work on it together. With craftsmen, I always bring in people because I don't believe in build, only design build workshops I find are a bit too simplistic because I don't want to teach them to become masons and carpenters, but I want there to be enough distance to be able to process all that into designing. So this is what they did in that workshop in AA. But in further projects I did of that sort, for example with thatch, here we see that the thatch is supported on GI wire. And these kind of things is what I call a negotiation of high tech and low tech, because low tech, there's a reason why it cannot go on. And high tech need not be abruptly so high tech that it completely upsets the balance environmentally, socially, and economically. So these are the kind of, studies, and also regarding explorations with how to finish the buildings, like the plasters, tiling, and etc. How can we do as much as possible from the place? So for instance, in some of these houses, the pigment that is put into the cement is also from the place. These are old wisdom of like stucco plasters and easy maintenance floors, etc. These are revived through craftsmen and giving them research opportunities, but then also exploring with new kind of pigments and materials from the place, looking at materials with a fresh, open mind, even if they are not available in a material catalog. And so a lot of projects, were about, these 25 years have been about 100 and some projects that I had built in South India. And they all have, a lot of them are not unfortunately documented, but this one, this was my own house. When I moved out of that hut, after 10 years, I thought it would last 2 or 3 years, but in fact I lived there for 10 years, and I even gave that house to someone else who keeps living in it. So I built this got to be known as the Wall House, and it became, it's so published that eventually I built it in full scale in David Chipperfield's Biennale at Venice, in the 2012 one, just prior to this one. So I'm going to explain something here about this project that, because I had started doing a lot of research with sustainability, that at that time this jargon was not so common. But anyway, to just simplify, the kind of research I was doing. Also academically, I was a consultant for the Catalunya Energy Institute, where we were dealing with green buildings and defining all this across different continents to find a common language of what these consumption patterns are of buildings. At that time, I realized that all these green rating systems reject brick. Brick is the first building material that has never been displaced in any transition, but because we've made the common brick so sophisticated now that it uses the optimum soil, it uses the optimum fuel, and gets a very high strength that is also over designed for most buildings. We therefore have lost our local bricks that people made. These are low quality bricks that I had revived from that area, where in each and every village, when after the monsoon, there's some kind of silt that collects. All over Africa, you find people making those bricks along you know, wherever there's that clay collecting. And I wanted to, through this house, by showing it exposed, I wanted to say maybe the time has come to value the low quality brick over the high quality one, because this brick is cooked by thatch and leaves and coconut shells and things like that. It has less than half the strength, and therefore we make thick walls, and these thick walls are actually good for the insulation. So I started discovering a lot of advantages in what we called the bad quality bricks. So I, with all the errors of, you know, that the fact that it's not uniform, I actually designed a pattern through which that brick would be perfectly acceptable and would not make any plaster and paint or anything. You know, monsoon is such a thing that every white wall will turn black. So when I had done the first house, which is very close to this project, it was all painted white and everybody thought it was very Bauhaus influenced and all that. And the moment I didn't plaster this building, they said that I was a contemporary vernacular person. They immediately slotted, you know, whenever you see a rustic material, people make very quick associations, you know, and they immediately put you in a label of social or green or whatever. But anyway, I see the same continuity in my work and the same quest. But anyway, this house, I'm not going to explain it, it's been published a lot. You know, there are elements of, you know, there's lime, even the lime that is used here has got a certain mixture of cement added to make it set faster so that it can be considered further in our changing times, etc. Because lime takes really long. So there are many intricacies in this kind of work, which I don't want to go into now. But anyway, so all that had made me pick this project eventually to redo in the Biennale, and also to reveal that the process could be more important in our times than the product, because through the process and through the learning of certain things, we will create eventually, automatically, another kind of architecture which is not, which I think if architects do not take into consideration these mega urbanization forces, we are going to be redundant. So I think it's very important to take the time, whether it's in academia, in research or in practice, to be able to really go deep into issues and come out, you know, not just by the surface and the form, but to really look into this deeper impact of what one is actually building. I'm just going to show some images. You know, for instance, in this kind of spaces, you see there are sometimes 2 or 3 layers of windows. Rather than being ideal for one season, it's been, I've often introduced, you know, that in monsoon you can use the outer layer in, just like we have this jacket, you can take it off. So everything need not be regulated for a standard solution throughout the year. All of this is actually common sense, but nowadays it is important to say that, because increasingly we cannot open any window in a building. It becomes, you know, we are looking for efficiencies where we can't interact anymore. You can't open the window because it will affect all the automated controls, you know. So I mean, I'm making a point against that. So in many areas of this project, actually there were 7 or 8 different roofing systems. Each of these things, like the filler slab that you see above here, was actually intended for a big hall, you know, because form work is very expensive when you build concrete buildings. So efficient dia grid slabs, etc., are not usually used. And so for various other projects, I had tested some of these systems in my own house, and that's why that house became something like a kind of a lab where a lot of different systems have been put together. So following this phase, I did a lot of housing, you know, where you see even the rammed earth that you see in these projects have been infused with some percentage of cement. So there's always this kind of negotiation, slightly more high tech, how low tech should it be, how many people have to be given jobs out of that project so that it is made locally and therefore affordable. So for me, affordability has emerged as a single largest concern today, and I think affordability not only in money terms but also in environmental terms. If if something that is green is going to be used by the elite because it's more expensive, it's not going to change the figures at all. So it's very important that whatever in today's times are done are affordable and sustainable, because the sustainability has to be an affordable one, or else it will not be applied by the masses. So I started doing a couple of prototypes for housing. This is a housing project where actually the urban infrastructure for water management, waste, etc., you know, recycling. This was in 2002. I had done one housing project and one public building where we were studying the patterns when you have hybrid uses, hybrid sources, whether it's energy or water, and then you manage all of that integrally. So, you know, some of these projects became more of a strategy of how to proceed with other projects. So this urban eco community, as it was called, was a very successful project. We achieved a quite high quality housing at a low cost. We had received the housing award that year in India, because also it had all those elements we talk about, including participation, etc. This is another system of high-tech, low-tech roof that you can put up, you know, partly prefabricated beams like jack arches, handmade extruded terracotta pieces that you can put together very quickly, and this was used in the housing. You know, all this, the three-storied building is ventilated through, you know, to create air circulation, and all those passive principles have been applied. But one of the most radical experiments I have done is this one, which I call Building with Fire. It was the topic of my PhD that I did in Berlin, where there's a Californian ceramist whom I had followed his work with a lot of interest. He built mud houses like this, and he cooked them in situ to turn them into brick. But fire is the cement. Fire brought, everything is made with earth. It's like, you know, if you make bricks in a kiln, 40% of the heat that you generate goes into the walls of the kiln. So he was trying to tap this heat to be able to then sell the products, but then you're left with a house. So this I found very intriguing, and I wanted, I mean, you know, you have a lot of ceramic uses typically in a house, from tiles to wash basins and water spouts and everything. So I had also built a few houses with this technique just because I was fascinated with any technique. I thought any technique that could possibly lead to any significant reduction in the budget or in the materials used is worth investigation. So I did 3 or 4 projects with this technique. In fact, this girl with the yellow t-shirt, she's from Mexico. She was a student of mine who participated. In all of these investigations, which are actual projects, this was an orphanage in Pondicherry. These are always open to students, because I don't believe in learning go to this university, teach what I already know. By the time the students graduate, it will be irrelevant. It's better that I work with them on issues that I don't know and I'm investigating. The thing I already know, I do in my office. The thing I'm investigating, I bring the students on board right from the beginning. When we investigate this together, then they will automatically know about everything about the brick. Even if we fail with something, you know, we need to accelerate. We have to involve them in the learning process. So here we've used, you know, we started using a lot of urban waste in order to construct, to lower the budget. So we stack these huge earth mud walls with mud mortar, filling it with mud bricks, cooking it for 3 or 4 days, and this is a small version. There are bigger houses done with this, and then, you know, sell the bricks. The house is cooked, you plaster it and finish it. The toilet block was built with glass bottles, and the centers were built with, you know, glass. Glass is a vitrified product. It continues very well with ceramic, but sometimes building materials, when not sourced from the building industry, are a lot cheaper, and they are equally good like for the construction. So here you see a lot of mix of, you know, building sometimes with whatever we have, because it's very important that the people who don't have any budget be helped by architects, because they need design more than anybody else, because it can make a huge difference to their lives, and they are the majority today, you know. So it is our duty, I feel, and I don't think it's a social service I'm doing, it's the more challenging creative work. It's about design efficiency, and I would ask all of you to please take interest and, you know, help the sector of people who have very little means, because when you work for them, you really become creative. Anyway, here I would, so around here, what I'm showing here now is that the invitation by David Chipperfield to express common ground through my own proposal. And what I did here was that, you know, the brick city that Venice is, with all the layers of brick history, I thought it would be very good for me to bring in all my brick research. You see, there's ceramic tiles with all the amount of wood used here, and the structure in ruin, you know, revealing how it was constructed. It's the same way I wanted to add a project which is under construction, architecture in ruin along with architecture under construction, both revealing, without any posters, without any anything else, without models or anything, directly in human scale, revealing how architecture is an integral, nothing but a synthesis of everything else. So I wanted to show that common ground is in the making of architecture. We are more common than we are different, as I believe, and that we are building gently layers upon other cultures that have discovered and advanced building technology. So I had the opportunity to document how brick is made, how it's fired in the huge landscape it affects, you know, whether you use brick or you use lime or you don't use lime and suddenly use Portland cement, you're displacing a whole lot of people that you don't necessarily you're not aware about. So I wanted to, you know, use this occasion of building in full scale inside the Corderie in the Biennale and explain how many hands are involved in architecture, how many people are involved in even the construction of one house. And that is the common ground for me, that architecture involves everybody. And we only don't know about it often. And so I documented all these things, but I of course didn't show it there, but it, you know, it is, you know, architecture has to be visited, and I don't want to force all this information but this is, you know, you see if what happens, there are whole communities working with lime and our generation is displacing them because we just automatically, unconsciously continue with Portland cement. So all these materials were brought to Australia and tested. It was an opportunity for research, ferro cement, all the tiles and everything. 20 students from Australia, 10 students from Venice, a team of 10, 6 craftsmen from India, without common language, everybody building together over 6 weeks, full scale, building the whole house. Every boulder, every bit of earth was brought from there to actually show, according to David Leather-Barrow, that talk about the uncommon ground, in the common ground exhibition. So here you see that the current Venetian bricks are so different from their own bricks. This was in our foundation because that's the ground. And on it we built with our own material. We interwove the entire house, you know. That's what I mean by building knowledge. We're building this, but we are also building a knowledge for lots of people. So even if we hadn't succeeded, a lot of people would have learned a lot of things. So the money is not wasted in just the exhibition. Australian engineers, you know, we did a few things that we didn't do in the original house, like we investigated how to do the roof with wine bottles or recycled other bottles. And then finally the end result was this dialogue between the old walls and the new walls. And the space was a complete coexistence. The new must coexist with the old, and it need not be confrontational. So even the dining table was brought from the house, you know, and the point is that full scale is the common ground. No mystification, everyone understands everything. We did the whole landscape and everything. And here I would like to show the similar thing with that I was asked to do ironically, I was asked by a group in Milan and Russia. They are doing a thing all over the world called Made in Japan, Made in India, etc., of design products that are handmade, promoting handmade culture to be not lost. And I was asked to do a luxury showroom and to talk about luxury. And I said luxury is time to make, you know, whether it's food or whatever, time to have the time is luxury. So I had tried to establish the problems of stone cutting community, you know. In South India, they make grinding stones and they have the skill and they don't know where to apply. And so this is, for instance, one project where everything was, in fact, these slabs are handcrafted. It's a temporary exhibition, but all the system of these undulating shelves were, and they are just placed and balancing by their weight and placed among stone chips. And when the exhibition is over, it looks very permanent. And when the exhibition is over, we just carried everything off in 2 or 3 days, and some other people could buy those pieces. So yeah, now I'm going to just show you now a recent exhibition, installation that we did in Barcelona. It was called Unbound, the Library of Lost Books. Enric Miralles Foundation had invited us along with 6 other teams and 6 architects who did works here. But because I have been using, you know, collaborating with students, I wanted them to investigate books as a waste material, because many cities, like even Spain has to burn their books, or cities have to pulp books. There's a huge industry in dismantling, I mean, in disposing books, unwanted books. So this was a topic of a lot of research. We were building with books, and in the Museo Eco, where we were invited, we actually asked students to investigate. We said, imagine in this utopian country, Museo Eco, there's no other material. There were just old catalogs in the storeroom. Let's see, we go to a place, what can we build with what is there before we buy anything? So here we had to build with books. So they had to do projects for the future library in the digital age, but all the ideas had to be illustrated with only, you know, people made their models with, they had to cut books. It's a bit of irreverent thing to do, but the fact is that these books are going to be disposed anyway. So we had made sofas, etc. So explorations in full scale are very important while they are talking about larger scale. I always encourage some full scale exercise on the side. So this was our intervention, because it was in Spain, and I thought that the way they pack their ham is a household object. You know, it was the least precious thing. Everyone's used to seeing it, and it's a way of extending the knowledge, you know, preserving this material, the book. So I had actually made canopies out of these elements, and we had built the trees. You know, we have cut so many trees to make books, and we're not using the books, so let's put the trees back. That was the idea, and it doesn't matter the polarity, whether the book should go out or not. What is important is that you keep reading. So you can read on your iPhone, you can do whatever you want. You know, you are under the shade of the books, how people used to read earlier. And you know, this is our recent work in Barcelona. I'm going to quickly wrap up because I've just finished my time. So this is, I'm investigating ferrocement as a material that I think is increasingly important in developing countries and developed countries, and I seriously see promise in this material. My current research is totally about how to use, through geometry and engineering, how to be able to use significantly less material. So the strength of, you know, of the structure will come from the design of the form. And therefore, we have, in this case, for affordable habitat, we have been studying the crease patterns in origami. We are trying to build form work. Because the ferrocement is so light, it has to be less than 2.5 centimeters. So light structure means light formwork, and hopefully we can use paper formwork, recycled paper. And you know, this form could be wrapped up like this. You can go to a site, you know, to a disaster place or wherever, open it up and built, there's such little reinforcement, I mean significantly less material used in this, and it's strong because of the fact that it has been folded just like paper. So this is my current investigation. I've created a research wing called Affordable Habitat here, and we have just been to India where we tested a building system which we've designed. Hopefully people could put up this house in 3 or 4 days. So these are ferrocement elements, these are self-contained blocks. Our students are working in villages. We are hoping that this kind of blocks could be manufactured in the prefabrication is there, but it is made in the houses of masons in the backyards as and when anybody could make it. And then we collect those pieces, and this is very much like Mexico, I found, by the way, that people are just painting whatever colors, and feeling happy through the color, because the rest of their life is really hard. But there is a wish to be happy, and it works with color. So we decided in this project, it's really a low-cost thing. We put the color on the inside of those ready-made blocks. It's like a Lego system. You can put it up in dry masonry. We have exhibited this last month in a school in India. And this is designed together with, it's in one of those workshops that I do. And all the color is on the inside because we're inhabiting the wall space to put all our projects there, including the kitchen and everything. There's a kitchen platform in the purple thing. Everything is in those blocks. You just go and put it up. It's a kind of IKEA version of a thing. And to test that in 1:2 scale, I often work in 1:2 scale with children because it's their scale. And we did this also in another museum, helping them to colonize spaces and work with color. I will end with this last image of what our students did the last 3 days with the University Ibero-Americana, where we actually it's called the liquid wall. We are saying that, wall doesn't have to be a divider between people. It could be a backdrop, it could be an anchor. It has to be more porous. The walls of the future have to be more porous. It has to be more fluid. So it's made out of fluid. I mean, Tetra Pak is taken and filled up, the base layers with sand in this case. Eventually, my idea is to build with water, because it's got thermal properties. But these are perfect containers which are salvaged. It was a very disgusting job for our students who were, because these were all unfortunately milk cans and they have to deal with the smell of, garbage, etc. But something beautiful was, see, on one side it's all white and, it's like a Eladio Dieste type of a wall because it's a self-supporting element, and people had immediately appropriated the space and they started using it as a backdrop, and lots of activities were anchored there. But this is the last image. I would like to explain that is the nice side. Everything is looking neat. But the fact is, this is the amount of urban waste we are generating in our times is unprecedented. We are generating more ugliness than ever before. So we have if we want to, we have not only to reduce this kind of waste through awareness, but whatever is being produced by others, we should be able to transform and absorb in architecture. So with that, I would like to end my presentation. Thank you all for listening.
Muchas gracias.
Just want
Para
to
la
add